Leah sat by the window in the crowded airport, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She held a small blue ticket in her hand, the ticket that would change her life. This was not just any plane ride. It was the beginning of a new chapter. She was a young black girl from a small town. Growing up, she never had much, but she had always dreamed big. From the time she was little, Leah believed in the power of education. She had worked hard throughout high school, always going the extra mile to study, to volunteer, and to prove that she could make a difference in the world. And now, here she was, on her way to an important scholarship interview. The university she was flying to was one of the most prestigious in the country, and they had offered her a chance to prove herself. She had dreamed of this moment for years, and now it was finally happening. Leah looked around the airport. People were rushing in all directions, each with their own stories, their own lives. But to her, today wasn't just another day. It was the day she would take a giant step toward her future. She checked the time on her phone. Only an hour until the flight. Leah stood up, her heart racing. She had packed carefully, making sure everything was in order. Her passport, her scholarship papers, her dreams, all safely in her bag. She approached the gate where her flight would board. The airport was busy, but she felt strangely calm. The excitement was there, of course, but there was also a feeling of quiet confidence. Leah knew she had earned this moment. She was ready. As she walked to the gate, Leah couldn't help but overhear the chatter of the other passengers. Most of them seemed like they were headed to a vacation or a business trip, not a life-changing interview like hers. She smiled to herself, thinking how funny it was that she was the one who had worked so hard to be here, and yet it still felt like a dream. The flight attendants called for boarding, and Leah joined the line. She presented her boarding pass with a smile. The attendant at the gate nodded and handed her a small smile back. Leah didn't think much of it at the time. She was too focused on the journey ahead. As Leah walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, she found her seat. It was by the window, just as she had hoped. She sat down, buckled her seatbelt, and placed her bag carefully beside her. She was seated next to an older man who didn't seem to notice her at first. Leah pulled out a small notebook and began reviewing her notes for the interview. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Leah felt the familiar rush of excitement in her chest as the plane lifted into the air. She stared out of the window at the clouds below, her thoughts racing. This was her moment. This was her time. She couldn't help but remember the journey that had brought her here. The long nights studying, the rejections, the sacrifices she had made. But it was all worth it. She was so close now, so close to everything she had worked for. Leah was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the flight attendant who walked up the aisle. The woman was a tall, slim figure with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She smiled at the other passengers as she passed, but when she reached Leah's row, her smile faded. "Excuse me, miss," the flight attendant said, her voice flat and cold. Leah looked up, surprised. "Yes, your bag is too big for the overhead compartment. It has to go under the seat," the attendant said, pointing to Leah's bag on the overhead shelf. Leah nodded. She didn't mind moving her bag. It wasn't a problem. "Oh, okay. I'll take it down," she said, standing up to retrieve her bag. But as Leah reached for the bag, the flight attendant's tone suddenly changed. "No, don't touch it," the attendant snapped. "I'll take care of it." Leah froze. She hadn't expected the harsh tone. But she kept calm and stepped back, allowing the attendant to grab the bag. The attendant quickly shoved the bag under the seat without saying another word. Leah sat down, feeling a wave of discomfort wash over her. She tried to ignore it, reminding herself that she had bigger things to focus on. But something didn't feel right. The way the attendant had spoken to her left a bad taste in her mouth. The plane took off, and Leah tried to focus on her notes again. She was so close to the opportunity of a lifetime. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the flight attendant's coldness. It was the way she had treated her, like she was less than everyone else on the plane. Leah shook her head. "Don't let it get to you," she told herself. "You're stronger than that. This is your moment. Focus." But she couldn't help it. Every time the flight attendant walked by, she felt a chill. The woman didn't look at Leah again, but Leah noticed the way she stared at her from the corner of her eye. It was strange, unsettling. As Leah settled in, trying to push the discomfort aside, the flight attendant came back down the aisle. This time, she stopped directly in front of Leah's seat. "You, miss," she said in a sharp tone. "I need to see your passport." Leah blinked in confusion. "What? My passport?" "Yes, your passport," the attendant repeated. "I need to see it right now." Leah hesitated. Why does she need my passport? She wondered. But she didn't question her. Instead, she pulled it out of her bag and handed it over. The attendant took it without a word. She quickly flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the passport. Leah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something didn't feel right. But before she could say anything, the attendant took a step back, her voice cold and sharp. "Your passport is suspicious," the attendant said, her tone suddenly colder than ever. "You're not traveling today." Leah sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't understand what had just happened. 1 minute, she was dreaming of her scholarship interview, feeling excited for the future, and now, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. Her passport was being questioned for no reason at all. She glanced around the cabin. Every passenger was busy with their own thoughts, but Leah felt a chill in the air. It was as though everyone on the plane suddenly sensed something was wrong. The usual hum of the airplane felt muffled, distant. Leah's heartbeat thudded in her ears as she watched the flight attendant walk away, still holding her passport. Why is she doing this? Leah thought, biting her lip. This can't be happening. She looked down at her hands, gripping the armrest. The familiar feeling of excitement was gone. In its place was confusion, fear, and an uneasy feeling that something much worse was waiting to happen. Leah shifted uncomfortably in her seat and turned her attention back to the front of the plane. She saw the captain and 2 other flight attendants chatting near the cockpit, but no one was paying attention to her. No one was asking if she was okay. The attendant who had taken her passport didn't even look at her again. She had just walked away without another word. Leah's stomach twisted in knots. Was this some kind of mistake? Why was the attendant so rude to her? She felt a sting in her chest. It wasn't just the rude treatment. It was the sudden feeling of being singled out. Maybe I should ask her about it, Leah whispered to herself. But then doubt crept in. What if the attendant was just doing her job? Maybe Leah was overreacting. But the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. This wasn't right. The silence around her was heavy, but Leah's thoughts were louder. She couldn't ignore the growing anxiety in her chest. The flight was supposed to be a simple one, a few hours in the air. And then she would land, walk into that prestigious university, and prove that all her hard work had been worth it. But now, that dream seemed to be slipping further away with every passing minute. Why is this happening? Leah repeated softly under her breath. She looked out the window, trying to focus on something other than the chaos swirling in her mind. The clouds outside seemed peaceful, but inside the plane, things felt different. The tension was building, and Leah felt like she was trapped inside a story that didn't make sense. A few minutes later, the flight attendant came back down the aisle, but this time, she stopped right in front of Leah's seat again. She held the passport in her hand, flipping through the pages slowly, as if she were looking for something. Leah could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, but no one said anything. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to notice the tension between her and the flight attendant. Others gave Leah a quick glance, but no one spoke up. The silence was unbearable. The attendant finally looked at Leah with cold eyes, her expression blank. "I'm afraid I'll need to report this to the captain," she said, her voice still sharp and dismissive. Leah's heart skipped a beat. "Report this? to the captain. What was going on? What could possibly be so wrong with her passport? Leah opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to ask. She didn't want to look weak, but she didn't understand what was happening. The attendant turned away again, walking briskly toward the front of the plane. Leah watched her disappear through the curtain that separated the first class from the rest of the cabin. She felt the weight of the room shift. The atmosphere had changed. The calm had disappeared. What was going to happen next? Would she be thrown off the plane? Would she be arrested? Leah glanced nervously at the passengers around her. The man sitting next to her on the aisle pretended to be asleep, his head leaned against the window. The woman across the aisle stared at her phone, as though nothing was happening. Leah wanted to ask them for help, but she didn't know what to say. How could she explain something so ridiculous? Who would believe her? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she quickly pulled it out. It was a message from her mom. "How's everything?" Excited for the interview. Leah's hands shook as she typed back, trying to keep her voice calm. "Everything's fine. Just boarding now. Talk soon." She stared at the screen for a moment, then erased the message. Her mom would be worried if she knew what was happening. Leah didn't want to scare her, but she couldn't lie anymore. Everything wasn't fine. The tension continued to grow. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Leah looked at the flight attendants again, who were now whispering to each other in the front of the plane. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their nervous glances back at her didn't help calm her fears. Suddenly, the captain's voice came over the intercom, startling her. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he were trying to hide something. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief stop in a few minutes due to a minor issue that needs to be handled," the captain announced. "We appreciate your patience." Leah's heart raced again. What did he mean by minor issue? Was it related to her passport? Her mind was spinning. This was no longer just about getting to the university. This was something bigger. She was scared, unsure of what would happen next. The airplane's hum grew louder as the minutes ticked by. Leah's heart pounded in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. She glanced nervously at the other passengers. Their faces were a blur of indifference, some engrossed in their own worlds, while others whispered to their seatmates. But no one seemed to notice the strange tension that had settled over the cabin. She kept looking toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were still speaking in hushed voices, exchanging glances. Leah felt her stomach churn with anxiety. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew one thing for sure. This was not a normal flight anymore. The captain's announcement had done little to calm her nerves. A minor issue. What did that even mean? Was it about her? Was she in trouble? Leah turned the thought over in her mind, trying to push it away. No, this was just a mistake. She had to keep calm. She couldn't let herself panic. She clutched her bag tightly in her lap, her fingers digging into the fabric. Her passport, her ticket to her future, was tucked safely inside. But that didn't make her feel safe. What if they took it from her? What if they wouldn't let her go? Her mind raced, filled with possibilities. None of them good. The plane was descending now. Leah could feel the change in pressure as it began its descent toward an unknown destination. She glanced out the window and saw the landscape below, but it looked unfamiliar. Where were they going? A low murmur rippled through the cabin as the seatbelt sign lit up. The flight attendant started walking up and down the aisle, checking that everyone was seated and strapped in. But there was one thing that Leah couldn't shake, the feeling that all eyes were on her. Every few seconds, she could feel the stare of someone nearby. She wasn't sure if they were curious, worried, or just uncomfortable with the situation. Either way, it made her feel even more isolated. Suddenly, the flight attendant who had taken her passport appeared in front of Leah's seat once again. This time, she was holding a small notebook in her hand. Her face was serious, and her eyes were dark with an emotion Leah couldn't read. Leah's breath caught in her throat. What now? The attendant looked down at her with cold, sharp eyes. "We're going to need you to come with me," she said, her voice carrying no warmth. Leah's heart dropped. Come with her. Where was she going? What did this woman want? Leah hesitated, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. She stood slowly, her legs shaky. She was already on edge, and the idea of being alone with the attendant was terrifying. She had no idea what was happening, and she didn't trust the woman who had already made her feel small and insignificant. Just follow me, the flight attendant said, motioning for Leah to walk toward the front of the plane. Leah took a deep breath and followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. She glanced around, but no one met her eyes. It was as though everyone was pretending she didn't exist, or maybe they were just too scared to get involved. The flight attendant led her down the narrow aisle, stopping just outside the cockpit door. She turned to Leah, her face still expressionless. Wait here, the attendant said, before disappearing into the cockpit. Leah stood there, feeling like she was in a dream. No, a nightmare. What was going to happen now? She looked around, but no one spoke. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the airplane, and her own breathing, which felt too loud in her ears. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Leah was starting to feel the weight of the uncertainty. Why wasn't the attendant coming back? Was she going to be locked in her room? Was she going to be questioned? She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had worked so hard to get here. This wasn't supposed to happen. She glanced down at the bag she had placed by her feet. Inside, her passport lay untouched. It was still the only thing she had left that could prove who she was and where she was going. The door to the cockpit opened suddenly, and the flight attendant reappeared. She was holding a clipboard this time, and she looked at Leah with a strange mix of annoyance and authority. You're not going to be allowed to continue on this flight, she said bluntly. Leah's stomach twisted. What? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? The attendant sighed, her patience thinning. There's a situation. It's better if you don't make it worse by arguing. Just stay calm and wait for instructions. Situation. Leah's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been on so many flights before, and never once had anything like this happened. The flight attendant motioned for Leah to follow her again. This time, she led her to the back of the plane, where a small group of security officers was waiting. The sight of them only made Leah's heart race faster. What had she done wrong? The officers didn't speak to her at first. They just stood there, looking at her with neutral expressions. Leah felt small under their gaze. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Miss, we need to speak with you, one of the officers said. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Leah's stomach twist. Leah nodded slowly, her mind still spinning. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew one thing. She had to stay calm. No matter what, she couldn't lose control now. The officer led her to a small seat near the back of the plane, away from the other passengers. She sat down, trying to steady her breathing, but it was hard. Everything was happening so quickly. The officer finally spoke again, his tone firm but not unkind. We've received some concerns about your travel documents, and we need to clarify a few things. Leah's heart raced. Concerns? What could possibly be wrong with her documents? She had checked everything before the flight. Her passport was valid. Her visa was correct. Was this all a misunderstanding? But no one seemed to care about her explanations. They just kept asking questions, their faces unreadable. And with each question, Leah felt a little more helpless. Leah sat still, her hands trembling in her lap. The officers around her were quiet, waiting for her to speak, but she had no idea what to say. Every question they asked seemed to lead to more confusion. The truth seemed just out of reach, and with each passing moment, Leah felt more like a stranger in her own life. The officer who had spoken to her earlier leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning her face. We need to understand why your passport was flagged, he said, his voice soft but firm. Leah blinked, trying to process the words. Flagged. Her passport. She had never been in trouble before, never even imagined something like this could happen to her. She had double-checked everything before the flight. Her visa was in order. Her documents were fine. So why was this happening? I don't understand, Leah said quietly. I've traveled before. I've never had any problems. My passport is real. My visa. She stopped, her voice breaking. She didn't know what else to say. How could she explain something that didn't make sense? The officer gave her a sympathetic but stern look. It's not about your visa or your passport being fake. There's something else. He paused, as if trying to find the right words. We just need you to answer a few more questions. Leah nodded, her throat dry. She wanted to scream, to tell them that she had done nothing wrong. But instead, she sat in silence, feeling as though the world around her was closing in. The officers continued to ask her about her travels, her family, and the purpose of her trip. Each question felt like another weight added to her already heavy heart. She couldn't understand why they were making such a big deal out of a simple flight. But every time she gave an answer, the officers seemed even more confused, as though they were looking for something specific that they couldn't find. What was the reason for your trip to the United States? Another officer asked, flipping through the papers in front of him. His voice was sharp, and Leah could feel his eyes on her. I was going for an interview, Lee replied, trying to stay calm. A scholarship interview for a university. Why didn't you mention this earlier? The officer's tone was suspicious, as if he was questioning her story. Leah swallowed hard. I did. I told the flight attendants before we boarded. They knew. I was supposed to go directly to the university after landing. The officer leaned back, looking at her with narrowed eyes. Why didn't they tell us about your interview? Why was your passport flagged in the first place? Leah had no answers. Why? She didn't know. She felt like she was caught in a nightmare that had no end. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally stood up. One of them walked to the back of the plane and spoke quietly with the flight attendants. Leah could only hear snippets of their conversation, but the words she caught only made her more anxious. They mentioned something about security procedures, and Leah's stomach churned. She wanted to stand up and scream at them. This is ridiculous, she thought. I'm just trying to get to my interview. Why is this happening? But she didn't. She stayed seated, her hands still trembling, her heart racing. The door to the small compartment they had seated her in opened again, and the officer who had spoken to her earlier returned. His face was serious, but there was something in his eyes that made Leah's heart sink. He held a piece of paper in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. We have reason to believe there's been a mistake, he said, his words slow and measured. But we need to investigate further. You'll be escorted off the plane when we land, and we'll take you to the authorities. Leah's eyes widened. Escorted off the plane. What was happening? Why couldn't they just let her go? Her thoughts spun in a dizzying circle. I haven't done anything wrong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, I just want to get to my interview. I don't understand. The officer gave her a long, hard look. We're doing our best to figure this out. But right now, we need you to stay calm. The officer's words barely registered in Leah's mind. She felt like she was outside her body, watching everything happen to someone else. She had always been a good student, a good daughter, a good person. Why was this happening to her? The plane was getting closer to the ground now, the cabin filling with the usual sounds of descent. But Leah barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with questions that had no answers. She looked out the window, but all she could see was the sprawling landscape below, fading as they descended. The plane had come to a stop, but Leah didn't feel any relief. Instead, she felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. The seatbelt sign flickered off, but she didn't move. Her body felt like it was stuck in place, as if something heavy was pressing her down. The officers had left the small area where she was seated. The sound of the plane's engine slowly dying down was the only noise she could focus on. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime, and Leah knew the moment the plane door opened, her life would change forever. She looked around at the other passengers who were getting ready to leave, gathering their belongings without a care in the world. None of them knew what was happening to her. None of them could understand the terror she was feeling. Leah's thoughts were racing. Was this really happening? Was she about to be escorted off the plane by authorities? Why? Why was she being treated like this? She glanced at the flight attendants who were now standing at the front of the cabin, talking quietly amongst themselves. Their eyes avoided hers. Leah felt a cold lump form in her throat. They knew. They had to know something that she didn't. Why hadn't they helped her? Why had they allowed this to happen? Suddenly, the door at the front of the cabin opened, and two security officers stepped inside. Leah's heart skipped a beat as they moved toward her. They didn't speak to her at first, but their presence was enough to send her stomach into knots. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, turned to Leah. "Miss, we need you to come with us," he said in a flat, emotionless tone. Leah stood up slowly, her legs shaking. This is it, she thought. This is the moment. She followed the officers down the narrow aisle, feeling the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some were curious, others just looked away, pretending nothing was wrong. But Leah felt every pair of eyes on her like a heavy weight. She wished she could disappear. The officers led her to the front of the plane, and Leah could see the plane door open ahead, with two more security officers waiting outside. The air outside seemed colder, and the bright lights of the terminal flashed in her eyes as she stepped off the plane. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, but it was no use. The cold air did nothing to ease the fear that had settled deep in her chest. As they walked toward a small room off to the side, Leah's mind spun. What was going to happen now? Would she be arrested? Was this all some huge mistake that could never be fixed? The officers led her into a small interrogation room, and she was told to sit. It was a cold, sterile place. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow over everything. Leah felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. How had everything gone so wrong? The officers sat across from her, not saying a word for a long moment. Leah could feel the tension building, her hands clammy on the table. Why weren't they speaking? What did they want from her? She glanced around the room, her mind racing for any clue, but there was nothing. Just the silence, the weight of the moment. Finally, the tall officer spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We need to verify some information. Can you tell us again about your travel plans? Why did you not mention your interview earlier?" Leah looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion. I did mention it. I told the flight attendants when I boarded. I'm going for a university interview. I've been planning this trip for months. I don't understand why this is happening." The officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We know you've been planning this trip for months, but there are some inconsistencies with your documents that we need to clear up. We need to know the full truth." Leah's head spun. Inconsistencies. There was nothing wrong with her documents. She had checked everything carefully. The officer must have been mistaken, but she couldn't find the words to argue. Everything was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Another officer, a woman with short, dark hair, stepped forward and placed a stack of papers on the table. Leah's eyes quickly scanned the papers, and her heart sank. There was a printout of her passport information and a flight record. It all looked fine. So why was she being treated like a criminal? "Look, I've done nothing wrong," Leah said, her voice rising with frustration. "Please, just look at my passport. It's real. My visa is valid." The woman didn't react, just stared at her. "It's not about your passport or your visa," she said coldly. "It's about your purpose here. Why are you lying to us?" Leah froze. Lying? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth. I have nothing to hide." Her voice cracked with desperation. The officers exchanged a glance. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Leah had never felt more helpless in her life. Finally, the tall officer spoke again, his tone softer but still serious. "We need to run some checks. We're going to make sure you're not a threat to national security." Leah's stomach twisted. National security. She had never even been in trouble before. She was just a young woman trying to get an education. What did this have to do with national security? The officers left the room, closing the door behind them. Leah was alone, sitting in the sterile room, her mind racing. She felt trapped. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a mistake. This was something much bigger. Leah sat in the cold, sterile room, her hands resting tightly on her knees. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. She was alone now, with nothing but her own thoughts to keep her company. She couldn't stop thinking about the questions the officers had asked, about the strange things they had said. National security. Why was she being treated like this? The room felt smaller with every passing second, the walls closing in around her. Her heart raced with anxiety. What was going on? Why hadn't they let her go yet? The thoughts swirled in her head, mixing with the sound of her fast-beating heart. Suddenly, the door opened, and Leah's breath caught in her throat. The officer she had spoken with earlier, the one with the stern face, walked in again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man who looked different, older, with graying hair and a sharp, serious expression. He wasn't dressed like the other officers. He wore a dark suit, the kind of suit that made him seem important. Leah's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? Why was he here? The officer stepped forward. "Miss," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is Mr. Thompson. He's with the government. He's here to help with the situation." Leah's mind raced. The government? This was getting worse by the minute. What was going on? She couldn't make sense of it anymore. Mr. Thompson took a step closer, his eyes studying Leah with a sharp, calculating gaze. "I understand you're confused," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "And I know this situation is not what you expected. But we need to clear up some things." Leah nodded, her throat dry. I don't understand. Why am I here? I haven't done anything wrong." Mr. Thompson didn't immediately respond. Instead, he motioned for the officer to leave. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving Leah alone with the man who had just made everything feel even more serious. For a moment, Mr. Thompson stood silently in front of her, as though weighing his next words carefully. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and intense. "I'm sure you've heard about the recent threat on national security. We've been tracking certain individuals. And your name. It came up." Leah blinked, stunned. Her name. She had never been involved in anything like that. She was just a student, trying to get a scholarship for her future. She had no idea what he was talking about. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I'm just trying to go to a job interview. I didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Thompson's gaze softened slightly, but there was still an air of seriousness about him. "It's not about what you've done. It's about what we believe you might have unknowingly gotten involved in. We've traced your travel plans, and there are certain things that don't add up." Leah's head was spinning. This didn't make any sense. How could her simple trip to a job interview be connected to a national security threat? She wanted to scream, to demand that they let her go. But instead, she stayed quiet, waiting for more answers. "I'm going to be honest with you, miss. Your passport was flagged because it was connected to a series of recent incidents that we're still investigating. We believe you may have unknowingly been caught in something far bigger than you realize," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady. Leah's mind struggled to catch up. She had no idea what he meant. A national security threat. Was this a misunderstanding? Could they really be blaming her for something she didn't even know about? "Listen," Mr. Thompson said, his tone softening a little. "We're not accusing you of anything, but we need to ask you a few more questions. We need to be sure that you haven't unknowingly been involved with individuals who might be dangerous. Leah's throat tightened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This couldn't be happening. Her dreams of the future, the scholarship, everything, felt like they were slipping away. She had never been involved in anything criminal. She didn't even know how she could be part of some kind of security threat. "I don't know anything about that," Leah whispered. "I don't know who you're talking about." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I understand. But we have to verify everything. The truth is, your passport was used by someone else before it was issued to you. We're investigating how and why." Leah's mind went blank. Someone else. Her passport had been used by someone else. She couldn't wrap her head around it. But she had never done anything wrong. "Wait," Leah said, trying to steady her voice. "Are you saying my passport is fake? That I'm somehow involved in something?" Mr. Thompson sighed, shaking his head. "No, your passport isn't fake. But the connections between your travel records and certain individuals are raising red flags. We need to understand how your name got mixed up in all of this." Leah's hands clenched into fists. This couldn't be happening. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now it felt like everything was falling apart. "But I don't know any of these people you're talking about." Leah's voice cracked. "Please, you have to believe me. I just want to go to my interview. I've done nothing wrong." Mr. Thompson looked at her, his gaze softening just a little. "I believe you, miss. But until we have answers, you'll need to stay in our custody. We're going to do everything we can to clear this up as quickly as possible. But right now, we can't take any chances." Leah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had no idea how long this would take or how she would get out of this nightmare. All she wanted was to go home, to continue her life, to finish what she had started. But it seemed that fate had other plans for her.